This is the Polaroid X530, a digicam from 2004 that would have cost you $400 brand new if you could have actually ever bought it. And that's because shortly after it was released, it was pulled from the shelves mysteriously, with some sources saying that less than 100 of these were ever produced. Some people said it was never actually released at all. That's all extremely difficult to verify based on just random sources online, but it doesn't matter because either way, this is an extremely rare camera. Certainly one of the hardest I've ever tracked down. I had Google search alerts and eBay search alerts out for 2 years before finally picking this one up with its original box and accessories, ironically for almost the same price that it cost 20 years ago. But besides just being so rare, there's actually a reason this camera is so special. This camera uses a unique small 1/1.8 inch size Foveon X3 image sensor. Foveon being the most unique sensor technology, I think. Most people know Foveon sensors because of Sigma, who has released to date 15 cameras with Foveon sensors. But many people don't know that Foveon first existed as its own company starting in the 90s that were trying to sell their sensors to other camera brands. And some other camera brands were, at least at one point, interested. Hasselblad even produced a prototype that used a Foveon sensor. But the only cameras to ever actually release in production were the Sigma cameras and then this extremely rare Polaroid. That makes this Polaroid X530 the only non-Sigma Foveon sensor camera ever to be released, and the only camera ever to use this particular sensor. Shortly after this camera was released, or not released, whatever, Sigma in 2008 bought Foveon, the company, and the rights to use the sensors. So that's why we know them as Sigma. The sensor in this camera is 3 layers of 1.5 megapixels, giving the camera effectively 4.5 megapixels in outputted resolution. The original advertisements claimed that this was good enough for, quote, superb 8x10 printed photos. So we will definitely be doing that test later on in this video. The camera originally came with a 32 megabyte SD card, which will hold 10 high quality JPEGs, or get this, only 30 RAW files. But luckily I have a 64 megabyte card, so I'm living easily. And actually, according to the manual, the camera supports up to 1 gigabyte SD cards. The camera also originally included this generic unbranded SD USB card adapter, which I've never seen bundled with a camera before in this like generic way. And that's not just the eBay seller throwing it in, it's in the user manual and the drivers for it are included on the CD. Also on the CD, by the way, is Polaroid Photo Lab software, which will be essential for opening up the proprietary X3F RAW files. And I will install this later and take a look. The camera has a 35mm to 105mm equivalent zoom lens from f2.6 to f3.4. And interestingly, the original prototype images, the lens was branded by Ricoh, but my production camera is just labeled Polaroid. So who made the lens exactly, I'm not sure. Prototype images also showed a silver and black version, but all the production models I've ever seen are all black like this one. So I don't think a silver one exists, although that would be cool if that ever came out in the wild. It uses an easy to find battery that was also used in Olympus cameras, which makes it very usable today. And there's a little cheesy splash screen when you turn the camera on and a goodbye when you turn it off that I thought was cute. But I'm getting ahead of myself. On the outside, the Polaroid X530 looks like a pretty cheap, mundane digicam, and you could easily misplace it for another junk camera from the early 2000s worth only $5 today. Which, going back to the rarity thing, it makes me think how many of these are sitting in someone's garage unnoticed or even ended up in the dump because it just doesn't look special at all. That makes me sad. It is a pretty cheap camera, which is, not fun when you paid $300 for it. There is a nice kind of chunky rubberish grip here on the front, so I guess that part is kind of nice. But there's actually a good reason for the cheapish build quality here. Our first hint comes with this little tag I found inside the box, which in extremely small text informs you that this camera was in fact not made by Polaroid, but a company called Worldwide Licenses who bought the rights to slap the name Polaroid on their products. And once you find out that companies do this all the time, and mostly to like classic film era camera companies, it just destroys your faith in branded cameras. On the bottom of the camera also shows in fine print the same thing, abbreviating the company to WWL. So let me back up a second and explain how Polaroid got here. Polaroid is obviously a legendary film era camera company, a pioneer in instant photography and more. I actually own Polaroid's first digital camera. It's this, the spaceship-looking Polaroid PDC 2000 from 1996, which has a built-in 40 megabyte hard drive and sonar autofocus. This camera cost nearly $4,000 back then and was aimed at a more professional photographer digital workflow crowd. It wasn't until a little bit later that Polaroid turned to making affordable everyday digicams. But by 2001, Polaroid was in bankruptcy and a series of sell-offs and reorganizations of the company took place. In 2002, Polaroid sold its naming rights to another company to make official licensed cameras under the Polaroid name, and the Polaroid X530 was one of the first in this wave of knockoff cameras using the Polaroid nameplate. Although, fun fact, this is not at all the most obscure, weird, bizarre knockoff Polaroid camera. No, that would come in 2013 with this crazy contraption, which I also bought. It was never actually released, so it shares that in common with this one, I guess. And I'll link that video at the end of this video because it is wild. And all that to say, this camera looks and feels cheap because it is cheap. And it's just interesting because being the only non-Sigma Foveon camera, the other Sigma Foveon cameras have been nice, high quality cameras that really had a huge price tag and premium features. And so it's just funny to see that type of sensor in like an everyday camera, which is what could have happened had Foveon attracted more buyers. Like we could have had more of these just like Walmart cameras with Foveon sensors. What a wild reality that would have been. But back to using the camera itself. It's a pretty basic camera, but there are some interesting things you can do in the camera itself. There's some basic settings for changing the quality of the image, including shooting RAW files in the Foveon proprietary X3 F format, and we'll look at those later. You have some basic image control options with exposure compensation, a manual focusing mode. You can also change metering modes and select ISOs. There's a macro mode that moves the elements in the lens to achieve a closer focus. So there is actually a decent number of manual controls here, even if there isn't a full-on manual mode, which is totally fine for this type of camera. There's also some basic JPEG photo effect modes like vivid, natural, black and white. There is also, surprisingly, an in-camera image editing mode. So I'm gonna hit the function button there, and then it just turns off for a minute, but don't worry, it's loading. Here we go. So there's a couple options here. We can rotate the image, we can crop the image, we can get rid of red eye, I think is what that is, and then there's some other modes in here. There are 3 image quality enhancement modes in here. The manual calls option 1 the color enhancement mode. You can see the color change there a lot. Option number 2 is the contrast enhancement mode, and then option number 3 is called levels enhancement. And then if I select one, like I'll select the color enhancement, and then I can save the file or save as. And now we have on the card the original image, and then if I go back over here and wait a very long time for it to read the memory card, there's the modified image. So in-camera image editing for such a cheap camera, I was not expecting that. It's also worth noting how slow this camera can be. The startup time is slow, although I'm pretty sure you can shut off that splash screen to save a second or two. But the worst part is that the shot-to-shot time is officially listed at 5.5 seconds with JPEGs and a whole 11 seconds with X3F RAW files. And when you think about how intensive the Foveon sensors and files are in processing, it's actually kind of impressive they were able to pull that off at all in such a small, cheap camera. Although that does kind of hint at why this camera failed and maybe never even released to the market, as the average consumer would not have wanted to wait that long when other competitors on the market would have been way faster. To open the X3F RAW files, you can use the provided Polaroid Photolab software. I've installed it on my Windows 98 laptop and it works like a charm. There's also drivers on this CD to pull images off the camera directly via USB. And the first thing I noticed was how incredibly detailed the images are for such a small, low resolution sensor. Wow, I was impressed. The second thing is that this editor looks suspiciously like even the modern Sigma Photo Pro. So my hunch is Foveon made this software and skinned it for Polaroid and Sigma, and then Sigma bought the company and took it over, and now that's Sigma Photo Pro. You'd be wondering, since it's a Foveon X3F file, and that's the same type of RAW format that the Sigma cameras used, can you open it in Sigma Photo Pro? And the answer is not in modern versions, but in older versions. But I couldn't test that because none of those older versions worked on my MacBook. Polaroid Photolab works perfectly fine, so that's what I'll be using. Someone also suggested trying Affinity to open the files, so I did that, and this is what happens when you do. So my friend calls this digital Lomo purple, and it's a fun, happy accident that I started posting to Instagram for fun, but obviously not really what you want. Okay, but let's talk about the image quality from this one-of-a-kind Foveon sensor, because maybe that would have made it worth it opposed to all the other competitors at the time. And like other Foveon sensor cameras I've used, even from around this same time from Sigma, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's some really good things and then kind of some things to consider. First off, I think the colors out of this camera are actually pretty compelling. There's some really pretty greens and blues that look natural to what I saw in person with all their vibrancy. Maybe the sky is a little more turquoise in some of these shots than it was in real life, but I still think it looks really nice on a bright, clear day. The lens I'm actually pretty impressed with. According to the spec sheet, it has 10 elements with 3 aspherical elements. And I'd be curious if this was used on another camera, but in the marketing, they do say it was a specially developed lens. Either way, it's really sharp, and I think any softness you're seeing isn't a limitation of the lens, but it's the first big con to this sensor, which is ISO performance. Anything over that base ISO is gonna start looking soft very quickly. You're just going to lose an immense amount of detail shooting at higher ISOs, which makes the camera almost unusable indoors, even though there is a little flash attached to it. So you could certainly try. And we wouldn't be testing image quality without making some prints. After all, the original marketing said superb 8x10 quality prints. So that's this here. I don't have a great printer for this. It's just a random consumer inkjet printer, but here are the photos. I think they look pretty good. I want to go back to that claim that less than 50 of these were ever sold, because if that's true, that makes this one of the rarest digital cameras ever made. So when I was researching this camera, I kept seeing that number come up. Sometimes it was 35 were ever sold, 20 something, but it was always somewhere around under 50. And nobody could give any sort of credible answer to where that came from. I even asked some people and they just quoted other Reddit posts that I found. So it was unclear, and it's incredibly difficult to find information on this camera today. But then I did some sleuthing using the Internet Archive for Polaroid's own site back in 2004 when this camera was released. And what I found was really interesting. One thing was, on the site, this camera was listed under the X3 series category, meaning I think that if this camera had succeeded, they would have done a whole series with it, which would have been really interesting. Too bad. But then the second thing is you can go onto Polaroid's own shop back then and see this camera for sale, and it lists its quantity available in the hundreds. As late as 2006, this camera was available on shoppolaroid.com with 200-ish quantity left, an update from the previous quantity of 700 something I saw on the Internet Archive. And it was on discount for $219 with a free SD card. So I think from this we can conclude two things. One, as fun as it would be to believe that this camera, there's only 20 or 50 of them out there, it looks like it's way more likely there's hundreds, if not at least maybe 1,000 out there. And then two, this camera must not have sold very well. Maybe it wasn't available for retailers for very long, but at least it was available online at shoppolaroid.com. And apparently didn't sell very well because it was on sale for 50% off just a year and a half after its release. Using this camera in 2026 has mostly made me wonder about what the future of Foveon is, which, hold that thought, I got something to show you. The last Foveon sensor camera released was all the way back in 2017, and that's this camera right here with the Sigma SD Quattro H, which is the largest Foveon sensor made to date. Here it is right next to the smallest Foveon sensor ever made to date, which that's kind of crazy. That's in my collection here. 4 years now, Sigma's CEO has said they are working on their first full-frame Foveon sensor. This was announced back in 2018, but every year we seem to get an update that says, yeah, this is still going. In fact, the latest one I could find was from Petapixel interviewing the CEO of Sigma just a couple months ago. This Polaroid X530 is truly one of the weirdest, rarest cameras I have ever used, and such an interesting part of digital camera history. But it is not the weirdest camera Polaroid ever produced. That goes to this camera, the Polaroid IM1836, also not made by Polaroid, also not officially released. What a crazy story. Nikon sued them. Okay, there's a little spoiler. I'll see you over there in that video, and until next time, as always, happy snapping.